Gene Shaw used to have this seat in their house at number 2 Castine Street, Schenectady. And Darwin would start, and Gene would be in this chair, one of these reclining, they're called lazy boys or something. Yeah. And she, as soon as Darwin would start, she would, and she'd be out, completely out. And then Darwin would be here, and he'd look at her, he'd give this very bland, like George and Gracie, like he would look at her and go. Okay, so hello everybody, Jay Baba.
Jay Baba.
Happy to be here. My name is Michael Siegell, and I've been asked to talk about something about my life with Meher Baba. And I guess the place to start is at the beginning. So I am a baby boomer. I grew up in the 1950s and 60s in Queens, New York, in an area called Bayside. And my parents were the children of immigrants, like so many, and they were Jewish, but more or less atheist, like many of that generation in New York. Grandparents on one side, one of them was a little bit religious. So growing up in our tiny little apartment with an older sister, we observed the Jewish holidays, but it was more or less a cultural thing. There was never talk of God or spirituality, ever, in our home. And in fact, there was an attitude that was in our family and our cousins and all of that, that most of the people who were Jewish that were Orthodox or observant were a little bit crazy. Yeah, a little bit crazy. Out there, crazy. And I never questioned that because I was, we were secular humanists, I guess you would say. So, coming from that background, it was partly a historical and cultural thing of that generation of American Jews. Bar mitzvahs were a big deal. They were a cultural initiation, and in our family, not a religious initiation as such, which it is formally. So in order for Michael, who is the only son, I have an older sister, to be bar mitzvahed, you have to learn how to do stuff. And there's the short way and the long way. The short way is you just take bar mitzvah lessons for a couple of months to learn enough to do the ritual. But I don't remember how this decision was made, but it was decided that Michael would go to Hebrew school. And my mother would say, at least somebody in the family should know something about the religion. You're the guy. So the long and short of that is that after going to public school, after coming home at 3 o'clock, for 5 years, 4 days a week, I went to Hebrew school for an hour and a half, three afternoons a week, and then Sundays, for 5 years until I was 13. And it was mostly torture. It was. And to get, to sort of lay a foundation for my spiritual thinking and feeling, I could tell you that all the references to God that were presented me through that level of Judaism, I felt quite insane, to be honest. There were references to this old style God who was always having temper tantrums and laying it on heavy on his people. And us Jews in that moment were supposed to make references to this God. He who took us out of thousands of years ago, this and that. For me, at that point in my life, as a somewhat precocious, acting out American kid, I found it hard to swallow. And I didn't swallow it. I got kicked out of Hebrew school for doing some crazy stuff. At the end of the day, by the time I was 13, I did get bar mitzvahed. I had this big initiation in a synagogue, an Orthodox synagogue. Now, parallel to this, before I was 13, I guess I'd call myself philosophically minded. And I would read, and I really was involved in what we now call the search. It didn't come necessarily from anybody in the family. My parents were wonderful people, but not interested. We didn't have these talks. My sister was older, and she was into her own world. It was something innate. And I would read things and think about things. And I was an early reader in elementary school. And I cannot say why, but I had a very strong attraction to Asian religion. So by the time I was about 10 or 11, I was reading books on yoga and Taoism and things like that. And I used to go to the public library. I walked to the public library. I took out Swami Vishnu Devananda's complete illustrated book of yoga, which has all these incredible plates of people in asanas. It's a famous book. And I used to just keep it around and freak out my parents by just showing them these poses. And I did have an aunt who I made her lend me her copy of this book called The Wisdom of the East, which I discovered in Elizabeth's library, the house, in Meher Baba's house. She had that, edited by Lin Yu Tang. And I took that out and I'd read. And this was all happening when I was 10, 11, and 12. So about the time I was getting bar mitzvahed at the age of 13, when it was clear that, I could have a bar mitzvah gift. And that year, strangely enough, the day of my bar mitzvah, as figured by the Jewish calendar, was the same day as my American birthday. And that's very rare, apparently. So Michael has to get a present besides a party. And what did Michael want? I insisted on a Buddha, a statue of the Buddha. And that was a big kerfuffle, is that the word? Yes. Kerfuffle? In the family, and my sister, who was always my advocate, said, let him have it, it's his bar mitzvah. And my mother, who didn't know, and my father was, And the long and short of it is, one day we piled in the car and went from Queens all the way into Manhattan, lower Manhattan, to Chinatown. And I picked out a statue of the Buddha, which was to be my bar mitzvah present. Isn't that funny?
That's great.
And I set it up in my tiny little room with a little altar. And that was great. And this little aside, a couple of months later, my grandparents came to visit us. And I proudly wanted to show my grandfather the Buddha. And his line was, I suppose next year you'll get him a Jesus Christ. All right, so in these years, this is all pre-Baba, but it's setting the stage, right? And as I said, I was drawn to the East and I was reading these things. And some of you will remember this, but Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the Beatles' guru, he appeared for a number of times on Johnny Carson's show. Does anybody remember that? Yeah. And it was hilarious and charming and wonderful and ridiculous, all of those things. And I don't know how real my draw was, or I just thought it was a little naughty, but probably all of those things. But I was charmed, and I decided that I would learn transcendental meditation, which was happening in those days, a system that was available. So I was either 14 or at the most 15, where I secretly searched out the process by which you get initiated to learn TM, which was the hot thing in those days in New York. And you had to go to 2 introductory lectures, right? You had to not be taking drugs and this and that. Although I was smoking marijuana by the time I was 14 in New York, a bit. So I went to the 2 introductory lectures, which were near Little Carnegie Hall in Midtown Manhattan, and I believe that's where Norina gave some talks,
Yeah.
right? And there were some of those introductory lectures, and I had to lie to my parents because it was about a 2-hour trip for us to go from where we lived in Queens on a number of buses and subways to get there, and I was meeting my friends, we were going to go to the museum or something like this, and I had to lie. I was going by myself to these lectures, and I was so entranced by this description of these different states of being and consciousness and all of that. I remember going back home and describing to my sister, trying to describe, and I could not describe what it was. What was going on was something was awakened in me that recognizes some kind of metaphysical truth, and I couldn't translate that into words, and I'm sure I sounded like a complete raving idiot to her, but she was fine. Remember I could not describe what it was that attracted me. So I went to the lectures, and then if you're below the age of 16, if you want to take the final step to get initiated, you needed a letter from your parents, permission. Some of you may remember that. So I forged a letter from my parents. I did. And I got initiated, and I started to practice in my tiny little bedroom. And later on, my father comes in. I got busted. He saw me meditating, and it was a very big deal, I'm just setting the stage. So I was interested in all of this stuff, and this was going on for years. But by the time I was 17, I went off to college. I went to college when I was 17. I went off. I left New York City. Now we're getting close to Mayor Baba coming. It's 1969, and I go off to a state college in a little village called New Paltz, which is south of Woodstock. And by the time I went to New Paltz to start my first year of college, we're full in the swing. It's 1969. We're full in the swing of the hippie thing, all of the cultural things that are going on, interest in the East, psychedelic drugs, music, a big shift. I had absolutely no career plans of any sort. Basically, I just wanted to get away from home. And I did. And I was in the mountains, and it was gorgeous, and I had a rapturous first year, doing nothing about academics at all. And I went through an intense period of, we'll say, experimentation with substances at that point. That was the peak year. But by the time of that first year winds down, and I'm 18, I am inwardly starting to adjust myself, inwardly, to the admonition by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and others that doing these things is not compatible with higher levels of consciousness and transformation that mean something. I could not say it that clearly, but I was tuned into that. And I knew that this was a time-limited thing, and it was getting ready to wind down by the time I was 18. So after my first year of college, like many others, for the summer break, I get in a VW van from the East Coast and go cross country with 5 other friends from college, lots of hashish, which I had just stopped doing, and Grateful Dead tapes. And we're going across to California. That's it. And we stop along the way, and we camp at state parks, and while my friends are doing this, I'm reading Nikos Kazantzakis' book on St. Francis. And the importance of that, do some of you know that book?
Yes.
Kazantzakis, the great Greek author who did Zorba the Greek and The Last Temptation of Christ. And the importance of this book on St. Francis for me at that time was, for the first time in my life, I had a sense of the possibility and the vibrancy of a personal connection with this state of consciousness or of being, this description of this other reality, which I had, by now, I was convinced existed and I was trying to get to in various ways. Very intellectual approach for me, and I thought of meditation or whatever I read from other practices as a way to somehow merge with this impersonal order of things. I guess philosophically, more than anything else, I would call myself a Taoist. There's this thing, and you become one with this thing that's one with everything else. I guess that's what I was. But then I read St. Francis's book, and there's this intense personal thing. And it had an impact on me. By the time the VW bus hits the West Coast, I leave the bus, and I'm on my own. Lots of things happened, and I made a contact with a cousin of mine, and then I hitchhiked up and down the coast, California, and I wound up in Tassajara Zen Monastery. I spent a little time there. I was 18. And when the time was up to go back to college, by the end of August, I fly back to New York, and I spend a week with my parents before I'm going to start year number 2. Here's where Meher Baba starts. Got sort of a setup. Yeah. So I'm with a close friend of mine in Queens. He's a world-class musician. Some of you might have heard. His name is Andy Statman. He's a genius musician, and he was a very close friend of mine. And I went to visit him. And he's talking in his room, in his house. I go there to meet him, and he's having a conversation with a friend of his, who I knew the name of, named Kenny Dyfick, who's a harmonica player. I didn't know Kenny Dyfick, but he's a friend of my friend Andy. And Kenny's about to go, and I'm about to start my time with Andy. And well, here's what I overhear in the next room. Kenny's saying, and there I was on my bed. He also lived in Queens, right near me. There I am on my bed, and I say to myself, if he's the beloved and I'm the lover, and I call, he has to come. He has to come. And I insist, you have to come, you have to come. And then he came. And there he was, floating right there in front of me. And some gestures, this or that, and he knew he could leave his body then, but it was not time. And then it faded, and now I'm overhearing this, okay? And my response, what I thought in that moment was nothing about, I heard the word Meher Baba. It was a sound. There was no sense that it was the name of a person. But all I could tell you is my reaction was, I was jealous and angry. Jealous that here's a person like me having an experience like St. Francis, and I'm not. And I've been dealing with this stuff for years already. But that was something. And, I wrap up my time in New York, and then I go up to start my second year of college. Now, here's where it starts. Early on, within a few weeks, I'm living in a dorm. And a number of things started to happen in a couple of days, and I don't know the sequence, but it all happened within about 3 or 4 days. One day I'm walking from my dorm to college to my class. I remember exactly where I was. And I become aware that I'm hearing a sound inside of myself. Meher Baba, Meher Baba, Meher Baba, Meher Baba. And it's just going on and on. And it's such, there's something about that, and I have to sit down, and I don't remember if I went to class or not. I remember where I sat down, I was walking. So this was going on automatically within myself without stopping. And it went on for some time. I could estimate maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I didn't really think about what it was. It was a sound. And then, being a small village, there were a couple of bookstores because there's a college there. And I went into a bookstore. And there was on the counter just below the cash register, it was, now I know it was the Ancient One poster. And I walked in, again, all by myself. I'm alone. I walk in, I see that, and as I read it, I was Rama, I was Krishna, I was this one, I was that one. Now I am Meher Baba. I am the Ancient One. And as I read that, there was a sense of authority. Authority, a kind of a power, an authority, a grand, majestic authority that was. And I felt I was like a bug caught on the wall. And I spent a long time, it must have been a long time. I didn't say anything, I didn't ask anything. I don't recall having a conversation. I may have, but I don't remember I even asked who is what. It was just something that had this almost total impact on me. And mostly, of course, it was the eyes. It was the sense of authority, being shaken, grabbed. Not scary. I don't want to say that. I don't want anyone to feel there was nothing unnerving, but totally caught. And then a series of experiences. Again, outside, walking to class. I suppose it was after seeing the picture. You know how to describe this. If you look through a screen in a window or a screen door, if you look closely, you realize that it's little boxes, right? Boxes, but you don't see the boxes unless you look closely. It was as if there was a screen in front of my eyes, my perceptual apparatus. And there were hundreds, maybe 1,000 Meher Babas. And it was looking through a screen of countless Meher Babas, his face. I could not see him. was like psychedelic, but I was not taking drugs those days. And I can't tell you the impact of that. In the moment, what I did about it, but I was. And then, this is probably the next to last thing. I was in the library of the college, and this college, I wound up being an Asian Studies major. I have a degree in Asian Studies, my bachelor's level. And they had a very good Asian Studies department in Asian stuff. And I was in the stacks, these huge stacks of books. And I was by myself. And it was almost like, proverbial God speaks falls on your head. It wasn't exactly that. But then I find my hand, I don't know if the word directed is too dramatic or too manipulative to say, but I found my hand going to a book, and very clearly I can tell you that this book was worn and very undramatic, no colors, nothing attractive about it, nothing flashy. And I take it and I opened it up and I did it and I opened it, and it says, "Stay with God." And my immediate first reaction was, that's disgusting, it's so trite. I was absolutely turned off. And then I look further, a statement in illusion about reality dedicated to Meher Baba. Meher Baba again! What the hell is Meher Baba? Not who. What is Meher Baba? I take this book out, it's a disgusting title. It's an unattractive book. I take it home to my dorm. And for the service, I start to read, and for the first time, I get a sense that Meher Baba is the name of a person. Then it sort of comes like that. And there's a story, and there's something. And it's completely surprising in a way. Isn't that amazing? Yeah, to me. And I get some information.
What year was this?
This is September of 1970. It might be the end of September or beginning of October. It was the beginning of the term, which didn't go well for me. It was my last term, and then I dropped out for 2.5 years. That's a different story. And then there's a story. This guy figures a bit into this part of the story. So there was one person in my life at that point who I had shared some of this with that was going on. This is a friend of mine that I played music with named Charlie. And Charlie knew something, maybe one other person knew something. I myself had no understanding of what was going on with me. This is a couple of days, and only in retrospect precipitated by this conversation in New York with my friend, overhearing this thing. So there I am, and I'm in my room, and there's a knock on the door. Hello, who is, yes, are you Michael? Yes, I've come to talk to you about Meher Baba. And it's him, this guy, Ira, who may or may not remember much about this.
Oh, I remember clearly.
Yeah, but
Mayor
here,
Robert sent me that weekend. He said, there's a love of mine at New Paltz looking for me. You must go find him. So I went all over in the snow. It was about 2 feet of snow. I trucked all over. That's why I found you.
so the story that was reported at the moment was Ira had a habit that when he would come to a town, he would ask, he had come to a decision in that moment that something like the third or the fifth person, there was a number, that he would meet on the street, he would ask if there's any Meher Baba Center or Meher Baba people here. And as it worked out, this is the story that I recall, the third or the fifth or whatever the number was of that person that he met was my friend Charlie, who says, oh, Meher Baba, go talk to Michael and send you to my dorm. So my experience was that The knock on the door was of a person who knew that there was who thought he was going to go talk to a Meher Baba person. And I had no idea. So that's what that was. And we had some time together, and a short time. And then I was left with a universal message. And here's what happened. Then this is after you had left. I was alone, and I remember very clearly this experience. I was standing facing this mountain in New Paltz called Mount Mohonk in my dorm room. And I read the universal message. You all know it, I think. And the experience that I had went like this. As I was reading Meher Baba's words, I experienced that it was, how do I say this? It was being recited to me through the heart center. I wasn't reading it, it was being declared. And I had, in a flash, a few, we'll say, insights, realizations. So to back up, I had said that my approach was very philosophical, that there is this disembodied state of oneness or something that we become one with. So what happens is, as I'm experiencing Meher Baba, reciting his message, telling his message to me, it went like this. If this thing ever had anything to say, rather than simply be, this is what it would say. So, he who has said this is that God can become man, God has become man, Meher Baba is God. Boom. And I was finished. I was crying and crying and crying. It all was this sort of threefold, fourfold experience, realization in one. It all became absolutely, demonstrably apparent and clear and experienced. The fact of incarnation and the presence of God through Meher Baba right now. Wow. And, I don't know if I was a mess or I was a delight for those days afterwards. I remember shaking friends and trying to say, do you realize what this means? And of course, none of that ever works. I don't know what I was like so much. But the important thing is that I was pretty much alone with this. And it was not too many years afterwards where I realized how important that was in my own story about being alone with this. Not completely alone, but alone in my being contacted inwardly by him, being set up, the whole build-up. And then the aftermath for some period of time. I mean, probably a year later, I met Darwin Shaw for the first time, and that's a whole other thing. And I'll just tell you this very brief part of that story, that Darwin Shaw, who lived in Schenectady then, number 2 Castine Street, Schenectady, was holding these meetings, and Ken Lux had arranged for him to give a talk at the Albany Medical Center, or Psychiatric Center, Medical Center. And I'm sorry, it wasn't there. It was at SUNY Albany. That was another talk. SUNY Albany. And there was a bomb scare. And so when the bomb scare, there's a very famous story. Ken might have told this story in the past.
I was there too.
You were there. It was 71, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was 71, yeah.
September, October.
Yeah.
71.
Yeah, it's a year later. It's the first time I met somebody who had met Meher Baba. I had almost no contact with anybody else for that year. I was sort of alone with it. And so Darwin gave a talk. And of course, those of you who knew Darwin knew what he was like and what he was capable of and what happened through him. And at the end of the talk, there was questions and answers. And there was a huge audience there. And I asked him the following question. Exactly not these words, but the idea was, okay, hold on to him, remember him, surround yourself with all the stuff about him. Okay, I get it. You met him, you have nostalgia. Isn't it a little crazy for those of us who didn't meet him physically to create what feels to be an unnecessary extra step? Because ultimately, as you say, he says, I'm not this, right? This body. And now that's gone. Find him as your real self. Why should we get wrapped up in all that just to discard it? I thought it was a perfectly reasonable question.
Yeah.
And Darwin, listened, and he said, almost word for word, not exactly, well, yes, these are attachments which ultimately will go, or illusionary stuff that gets discarded. But in this creation, this form of Meher Baba is the only form or thing in creation that it's not only okay to get wrapped up in, my words, wrapped up, attached to, but not only is it okay, but incredibly helpful. In fact, the form of the avatar is the gateway to the formless infinite. The form of Meher Baba is the gateway to the infinite. So go to that window. That seemed, he nailed it, right? All right. I would like to shift now. I mean, this is my beginning with Meher Baba. And I want to talk about my first time to India, which has a kind of a different flavor, but consistent with what I've just been describing, I think. So it's 1972, the summer of 1972, just about 2 years later. And I was traveling around Europe, and while I'm doing that, I was essentially hitchhiking around Europe for the summer. I was not in college anymore, I was a dropout. I did various things. And while I'm in Europe, I realize I want to go to Meher Baba's place. I had not met anybody who had been to India on pilgrimage. And it was not part of my circle of people, like Baba people. They go to India, and this is kind of early in our generation, And I didn't know anything about it. But I quickly got a visa, and I was in the north of Italy, and I had some strange idea that there'd be flights from Rome to India. There probably were. So I remember taking an all-night train from the north of Italy, and I arrive in Rome, and I somehow make my way to the Air India office. There's one there. I say, no, there's nothing like that. But there is an Air India charter leaving from Amsterdam in 4 days, which you could afford. See, in those days, there was a special, some of you from New York will remember, you get to India for $450 round trip. Do you remember that? Yeah. It was a special. And this was, and I got to Europe for $165 round trip on Icelandic Air. So I landed in Luxembourg on Icelandic Air, I had a return ticket and no other plans but hiking, hitchhiking around here. So, okay. So I could afford to get to India if I could get to Amsterdam in 4 days, and I had so little money, I essentially hitchhiked. I made my way to Amsterdam, and I made it, there's a lot of adventures that happened along the way. And I get to Amsterdam, and I get on a plane to go to Bombay, and I arrive in Bombay. Now, I didn't know anything about writing anybody or, money, or I didn't know anything about this. So in my mind, I'm going to a place called Ahmednagar, which I think is a neighborhood of Bombay. This is what is in my mind, because I hadn't met anybody who had done the trip, right? So after I deplaned, I remember going to the information office. I think it was even before immigration gate. And I'm saying, I'm going to Ahmednagar. How do I get to Ahmednagar? And nobody knew what I was talking about. Yeah. And at one point, somebody says, I think he means Nagar. Nagar. Oh, Nagar. He's going to Nagar. Oh, no. Nagar is not here. See, first you have to go to Pune. And that's a big deal. And you have to get to Pune. It's a different place. And then Nagar is a different place. Oh, no, you're not going to get there in an hour. So, oh, wow, okay. Somehow, I get to Dadar station. I don't frankly remember how that all happened. I get to Dadar station, exhausted, time lag, and long trips. I get to Dadar station, and I get on a train to go to Pune, which is it's not the Deccan Queen, it's a long trip. And on that train ride to Pune, I had long hair, I had a bright orange backpack, because I'd been hitchhiking around Europe. And it was early, it was 72. So I was an oddity. And I was in a compartment with young Indian college students who were on their way to Pune. This happened, they befriended me, who were on their way to go back to their college for the Air Force Medical Training College. There's something like that in Pune. When I speak to my Pune people, they know exactly where I mean. And so they befriend me and we talk, and they decided they're going to take me to their dorm and put me up. So that's really cool. So they take me and they sneak me into the dorm, which is highly illegal, and and if they get caught, it's a big problem for them. And I remember very clearly, very tiny little room, and there's about 20 of these college boys who are hanging off of the rafters, and they're grilling me and this and that, and we're talking. And we had a conversation like this, where when I said I had come from Meher Baba, almost nobody had heard of Meher Baba. And it was inconceivable to me. I had some kind of a notion that virtually everybody in India is on fire with Meher Baba. I mean, this is God's place, right? You're God's people, right? You're all Indians, you're all holy people, aren't you? And Meher Baba is here, and what? You're not out of your minds for him? They had never heard of him. It was inconceivable. I couldn't put that together. What that really tells you is the state that I was in, my naivete, as well as that I was kind of on fire inside. So that was eye-opening. Now, I had a practical problem with my charter ticket, and I had to somehow deal with that ticket. And I was told there was an Air India office in Pune. So I have to deal with this before somehow I get to Nagar. So they had to sneak me out of the dorm before 6 o'clock so that they weren't caught. And they threw me out on the street somehow, and they said, just go that way. And as it works out, it's in camp somewhere, so it's not that far. And Pune was very different in early '72 than it is now. You know, it was a smaller town, provincial town. And I remember I walked and I made my way to where their Air India office is, which is now where, you know where Dorabji's is, right? Most of you know where the Air India office used to be. I think it's Moladina Road, what it's called, yeah. And of course, it's early. Maybe it's 6:30 in the morning, and nothing's open. It's, you know, the thing is down. And I'm sitting, and I sit down, get to the thing, and I sit down on the curb. And I'm sitting there, and I look out at the street, and saris are floating by, a buffalo are walking, bells are ringing, and dust is there. And it really hits me in a very dramatic way. I'm in India. I'm in a different world now. Of course, I'm exhausted, but I'm in a different state, kind of floating. I have a couple of hours to kill before Air India opens. So I think, what do I do? And I didn't know the story that well back then, but Pune, Meher Baba was born in Pune, Babajan's tree. Oh, I know. I'll just go find out Babajan's tree and sit under that for a couple of hours. Now, even back then, I had no idea where, you know, how large Pune was, although it's small then, relatively. Who knows where I was in Pune? And who knows where Babajan's tree is? But I was actually very near, as luck would have it. So I start walking. I just walk up Moladina Road, just walk, and I just walking. I'm walking through the streets, and as I'm walking, in retrospect, I know I turned onto Synagogue Street.
Go figure.
La, Nu, Synagogue Street. I walk down this street, and the following thing happened as I'm walking. Maybe it's 7 in the morning by now. You know, if you swim underwater and you open your eyes and things are, you can see them, but they're kind of wavy. You know that? So it might be different now, but the old 2-story wood frame Parsi houses, what it was like. So it's narrow still, and I'm walking and like that, and they're all barely there. They're moving. I'm not hallucinating. They're wavy, and I suddenly know, without a doubt, that this is all hardly real. This entire world is hardly real, and in a second it can disappear. What I was seeing was not seeing the reality of what the world is. It was absolutely clear to me. It's floating, the floating world. And then I become aware that I'm surrounded by a pack of boys. It's like a pack. And they're saying, Meher Baba, Meher Baba, Meher Baba, Meher Baba. And it's almost like a cartoon where you see the ants carry away. And my mind isn't really working. I'm in this state, and I sort of get carried. It's like a little swarm of boys. Yes, Meher Baba, yes. And they bring me in front of this place. They knock on the door and they disappear. So can you get this? When I think about it, how dramatic, if a camera was watching this, it's very dramatic. And it felt that way even in the moment, but the boys did disappear. Maybe 1 or 2 were still there. They knock on the door. Somebody opens it. I look up, I hear a voice, come, and I walk up, I'm in this place, and there are photos of Mayor Baba everywhere. And I'm in this place, and then across, like where you are, a little bit distance, in the courtyard, there's an older man who's putting his clothes on. He says, come, come. Baba woke me up and told me you were coming. Come. And I look, and then he says, I'm Jal, Mayor Baba's brother. He woke me up, and I've been expecting you. And then I'm in his arms, and I just collapse. And after some time, he asked me who I am. What is your name? Where did you come from? Does money know you're coming? You didn't tell anybody? Doesn't matter. And then he says, you are here, you think you made the decision to come. You are here because he has drawn you here. His love has brought you here. His love will sustain you while you're here. And soon he will shoot you back like an arrow of his love to the west. This is what he says to me. But for now, we'll spend the day together. And we did. We spent the whole day together. You know, the usual Jal treatment, taking me to all the places. We have lunch, this and that, this and that. And there's another part of this story. I won't go into this, but I get my first sitar that day. I told that story last year when I was in residence. The sitar story, which is a different story in a way, but I did get my first instrument. And then by the end of the afternoon, when the day is almost finished, he's driving me to the Pune station to get an ST bus to go to Ahmednagar. I think he had rung up money to say I'm coming. I think he did. And we're in a rickshaw, and Jal is here and I'm here, and we're coming close to the bus. He's arranged everything. And I went through, during that day, I went through a process that many of you have gone through, which is trying to assess this guy who is acting in ways that didn't seem compatible with necessarily, you know, God's brother or some high disciple. I mean, there was some incongruent ways that he was being with others, which, wow, I wouldn't have expected that. How he'd shout at people, sometimes this or that. It was a mix of personality styles that was going on. It was very, very different than what I expected. That's what I could say since we're on tape. It was not what I expected. But back and forth, different things would happen. And then, okay, so we're coming up to the bus. And then he suddenly turns to me. He turns his face to me, and he looks at me. We're this close. He looks right at me and he says, I've become dissolved in his ocean, you know. And he was with me for a long time, just with that. He's absolutely serious. And in that moment, it felt absolutely yes. I hadn't thought about it, but that's what was communicated. Dissolved in his ocean, you know. And then he turns back, looking at the road. And I turned and I saw him in profile. It was Mayor Baba. It was Mayor Baba's profile, exactly. And then it stopped, then it faded. He puts me on the bus. I'm up there. Then he knocks on it, hands me English language newspaper, some candy, chewing gum. His money's waiting for you. I go. And I don't know much more I could say about that trip, but when I arrived, money was there. It was wonderful. Welcome home, and right there at the trust office just before they're leaving. There's a lot to say about what happened in Mehrabad, but this is the important part in which it's really clear to me that I was being directed and moved, and beneficence being poured onto me, and all kinds of tasty little tastes. I cannot remember the very first moment that I was at the tomb, but in those days, of course, it was empty, and this is now late August, September of 1972. And as I said, nobody was around. We could spend hours alone in the tomb. Some of you experienced it in those days. And one day, it was soon after I had gotten there, I felt, and I said to him inside, I said, this would be a very good time to make a big show for me. There's nobody around. I wouldn't mind at all to have some kind of, really profound mystical experience. You want to do lights? I've read what you said about lights and this and that. But this would work for me, right about now. I was more serious in the way I put it to him. And I go in, I'm all geared up, and as I'm bowing down, here's what comes. And if I switched on the light, if I gave it to you now, would you believe any more than you do right now that I'm God? And instantly the answer comes, no. That was the answer. And in that way, that was the experience. Would you believe, would it change what you feel or know about me? Not one bit. Boom, and I had a very human, quasi-ordinary time bowing down that moment. And I feel that was a great gift, a great gift.
How long did you stay?
So that first trip, there's so many things I feel now I want to say. That first trip was 6 weeks.
And how many people were staying there?
4 in Mehrabad. Me and 3 others.
And where did you stay at that time?
Oh, the Dalit Lodge, which was just a horrible place. But we were happy to have it, of course, those days.
So that was from when to when in 72?
September, I arrived in August into September.
Just wondering, this must have been a lot for your parents to take in. How did that unfold?
And what happened after you got back, since you dropped out?
That's not so dramatic. I sent a postcard to my parents from Europe saying, on my way to India, we'll contact you when I get there. And I have some of those letters now. I mean, they've passed. And later aerograms from India. And you can only imagine, the anxiety that they had. I mean, they had never met anybody who had ever had anything to do with India, et cetera. And they were worried enough about me, having dropped out and, and all of that. And they knew a little bit about my past habits. But there's a couple of things to say about that, about my parents and a sense of linkage, One is that my parents were very happy with Meher Baba in the sense that they knew that that meant no drugs. So, I mean, that's all that really mattered. Michael's a little weird, but he's okay, you know, and all of that. And of course, you know, my life went on, and in a worldly way, I would be considered successful, right? You know, PhD, I'm a professor. That all happened later on. They lived long enough to know that. And of course, I married Lakshmi, you know, and that was 35 years ago. And that was extraordinary.
Which reminds me, at your wedding, I strangely discovered I had this intense connection with your uncle.
Jerry, with Uncle Jerry, I know.
Did Uncle Jerry have any
No.
interest in your unfoldment?
He didn't know any of the details, but my uncle, I mean, we had an interesting connection. We didn't talk much, but he seemed to get that I was onto something that mattered. He didn't care about the details. But about my parents, let me just say that years later, so this first trip is 72, and I had several other trips. You know, I had 4 months in India in 77, and then the sitar story, which is a very dramatic story, living in Calcutta and getting the instrument that I played last night. So you all heard that story last year, those of you who were there. And other trips, and then marrying Lakshmi. And then in 1985 to 1986, we lived in India. Lakshmi and I did. I had a grant to do research on my PhD. And so it was funded, and we lived there. We had an apartment. We lived in Pune. And because we were there for almost a year, my parents did come to visit us. And this is, do you want to hear this?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a Meher Baba thing as such, but it is about spiritual life, I guess. And so they wanted to do a tourist trip, of course. And we were too poor to ever do a tourist trip. And they would only come if they could really stay at the Hyatts and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And so while I was living in India, I put my father in touch with Nashwan, who has no memory of this. He was living in New Jersey. And Nashwan, who was then working in tourism, put together a fabulous tour for the 4 of us, my parents and Lakshmi and myself. And it was a great tour. 2 things to say about that. I'll give you the Meher Baba part. So at the end of the tour, we went into our house in Pune, and I brought them to Mehrabad for 1 day. So this is 1985. This is 13 years after it's 15 years after I've been with Meher Baba already, 1985. And so we drive from Pune to Mehrabad. And it was the middle of an afternoon. We had lunch, and then we went up to the hill. And although, you know, my parents were not, you know, religious at all. They were atheists. You know, the idea of any kind of religious reverence was anathema to them. And I was figuring out, how do I get them into the tomb? And so I decided to reframe it. It's like, okay, we've just been to Ajmer. We've been all over the damn place. We've been to 100 tombs and palaces around India. This is another one. And I decided to be very casual and touristy about it. So okay, so this is Meher Baba's tomb. You can see it's fairly small. It's, you know, it's unostentatious. It's like that. And look at the dome, and look at that it's quite universal, and the different symbols. And oh, you see the threshold here. We have to be careful not to step into, you know. And look, and I was just very casual. And look at these murals. It's in a Swiss, not a crazy Indian fanatic. It's a Swiss modern dancer, painter, you know, and look at these lovely stylized, modern-esque kind of photo, like that, and I get them to circumnavigate like that. And then, oh, be careful, don't step on that because it's delicate teak wood, and, you know, like that. And here, it's customary, people like it, so they did this thing. And I got them out. And as I get them out, after they do this whole thing, I have a very clear feeling in me, like my dharma, my duty to my parents has been satisfied this lifetime.
Wow.
That was like a very clear thing. And we come out of the tomb, and we hang out with Mansari a long time. We had a very good relationship with Mansari, Lakshmi and I, because we had lived, we were living in India and hanging out a lot. She liked very much that Lakshmi only wore saris, and although she lived in the West with me, she was still quite traditional. That was a good thing for Mansari's ledger. And we hang out there, and then we leave, and then a car pulls up, and out pour the women Mandali. And as it works out, that was the day, the one time in the month that they're coming to this samadhi. So they meet everybody, Mera, Mani, the whole dais of the important people who were there. And that was remarkable. I did not know. And then we're only there for a few hours, and then we go, and we're on the way out. We stop at the trust office, and there's Erich. And he sits down with my parents and talks to them. Oh, Michael, we've always liked everything. Go back. So your question was, how are my parents with Meher Baba? Whatever Meher Baba is, seems to be okay. And that was a nice thing, to have that in my life.
Michael, what was your dissertation on?
So my doctorate is in psychology, PhD is in psychology. The dissertation is called Finding It as Oneself, a psychological inquiry into the classical art music tradition of North India. And in that, I talked about, from a humanistic psychological perspective, the psychology of learning and playing, teaching and learning and playing, something about audience, something about the teaching methodology between a music guru and a disciple, how that models the psychotherapeutic relationship in ways that would be understandable to you and Western psychologists. So I did a little bit of that. And I went into the aesthetics of Indian art theory, classical art theory, and how it could be understood experientially, from Western experiential humanistic terms. Emotion, the role of emotion in a human person. What is our relationship to emotion? How does that connect to art forms that are purposefully connected to the evocation of an affective state? And what do you do about that? What should you care about that? Is there a way to work that? Do you see what I'm saying?
So how did you meet Lakshmi?
All right, I'll tell this story.
Okay, good.
I'll tell you the Meher Baba part.
Okay.
Yeah. We met in the Boston area at a house concert where I was playing, and she was in the audience. That's the long and short of it. And
But where she was born.
well, she's from Andhra. My wife,
Nade.
Lakshmi, is.
Wasn't she, didn't Baba enter the town on her day?
So, yeah, so Lakshmi and I have the same birthday, and we discovered that on our first meeting just with each other. We have the same birthday, and it's February 20th. And it's also the day that Baba entered Andhra, I think in '54, for his tour. So there's a coinciding of that date, if you put any
The same village, or?
power into
So
that.
it wasn't the same village, I thought it was.
She was born in
Gujarat.
Rajamundry,
Oh,
yeah. And she grew up in that part of East Godavari district, the eastern part of Andhra, not Hyderabad, which is central Andhra. Now it's Telangana, Hyderabad. But so she's from the east, near the ocean, the eastern ocean, yeah, side of India. But here's a Baba part of our story that's really interesting. I think. I told this the other day, so I'll tell you. So, I will not talk about what was a very dramatic, we'll say, courtship period, in which Lakshmi, who is from a Telugu Andhra Brahmin family, her parents, as expected, were trying to arrange a traditional arranged marriage for her. And for a couple of years, they lived in our area near Boston. And so even though she was, my wife is a psychiatrist, and she was in residency in Boston at the time when we met, and her parents lived about an hour away, and they were trying to arrange her marriage with people both from India and in America from that community. And it never worked out for various reasons, and in the meantime, we met and we started to be with each other. But it was a secret relationship. It could not be told to her parents because it would have been catastrophic. And it wound up being that way for a period of time. But I will omit most of the details of this. They're personal in nature. But I will say that we got away with seeing each other secretly for a year before it reached a crisis moment where we had to make a decision about what to do about, what do we do about us? Is there an us? And we decided, I'm going to admit a lot of things. We decided, and she told them, and it was quite difficult for a while, but after a few months, it settled down. Her parents, and they accepted the situation, not happily, but they did. Okay, so then we're going to plan our wedding. What kind of a wedding? And she was somewhat traumatized by what had happened, the fallout from her family, so it was mostly done by me, the planning, with Baba friends, and we had decided to get married in a town north of Boston called Gloucester. And Mac and Annie Bell helped us find a place, because they're connected up there, and the place that we had our wedding was an old church which was just being converted to a performing arts space by someone who had owned it. And that place has always been known, it's still known now as the God-Man Church. And nobody knows why. People have always referred to it as the God-Man Church. And our wedding was going to be the first event after being changed. So, okay. So we're planning, very quickly we're putting together this thing, this ceremony, and Charles Haynes is going to come up and perform our wedding, which he did. Incredibly special thing. And at this point, the father had come to terms, and of course there has to be a classical Brahmin wedding. It's toned down and shortened right into an hour instead of 3 days. Because from their point of view, it was not a celebration. It was a like, okay, accept it. You've got to do something. So in those days, this is 1984, and the Indian community in the area was quite small, not like it is now. And so the father had contacted the proper, that means from their caste, from their subcaste in Andhra, a priest who lived in Pittsburgh, connected to the Pittsburgh Hindu temple. Yeah, nobody around Boston that they knew. And so he was going to come up and perform that part of the wedding. And 2 or maybe 3 days before the wedding, there's a blizzard and he has to cancel. So there's a mini crisis. And the word goes out in the Boston area, and some guy emerges saying, I could do it. I know the proper Sanskrit shlokas, I'm of the proper background, I'll do it. Okay, I'll do it. Okay. So the day is coming, and I had asked Lakshmi if there's a part of the ceremony. First of all, do we need to rehearse? Do I need to know anything? Do I need to study anything? Do I need to practice something? Nobody knows. She says, no. None of us know what goes on in these weddings. You just do what the priest tells you to do. He tells you to put water here, or you put a flower here, or you break it. You just do it. None of us know what we're doing. Okay, fine. Is there a part of the ceremony where there's ash? I have no idea. And the reason I ask is, I have a tiny amount of ash that was given to me from a fire that Meher Baba had lit in 72. Now it's 12 years later. And this tiny bit goes to births and deaths. Lifelong, small amount, a thimbleful. So she said, I don't know if there's ash being used, you have to ask the priest. So it's the morning of the wedding. And we drive up to Gloucester, and we are decorating it. We're tacking up with thumbtacks some of Lakshmi's saris on the black walls of the Performing Arts Center. And there is a Linot painting of Meher Baba lent by Steve Klein up there. I go up there in the morning, and the priest is already there. He's sitting on the stage, setting up. He has a little hibachi, a little miniature grill for the sacred fire that we have to walk around 7 times. He's putting out the coconut, the garlands, he's putting this, that. He's setting it up. He's sitting down. I walk up to him. He's sitting, I go to him, okay, and I just look, I say, namaskar, my name is Michael, I'm the groom, hello. Can you tell me, hello, can you tell me, is there a part of the ceremony in which ash is used? And he is puzzled. Ash? I don't know, why ash? And I go and I say, you see, and I gesture. You see, we're connected to Meher Baba. And if there's ash to be used in this ceremony, I'd like this ash to be used, if possible. This is ash lit by him, from a fire by him. And he hears this, and he goes, I beg of you, please give me a little bit of this ash. I too am a lover of Meher Baba. And he goes into his back pocket, and he takes out his wallet, and he opens it up, and pulls out a photo of Baba, whom he had met as a child in Andhra in the 50s. He's the substitute priest. I have to tell you, from the moment that I felt inwardly I feel I was contacted. From that moment, there has never been a moment, really, if you would press me, where there was a question about Meher Baba's divinity, or that he was who he said he was, or that he was the complete manifestation of God, and that he was available. Now, there was never any wavering in that. My own personal, what to do about that, there's been a lot of wavering. I mean, what do I feel about that? How am I doing with that? Meher Baba, as a fact, has never been beyond the horizon or off vision. But how I felt I was doing with it, or how much I experienced his working in my daily life, or that I'd be making mistakes or wasting time. The worst thing that I feel personally is wasting opportunities, which I feel acutely. Like the Begin song, what that speaks to. Yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah. And I had what I feel incredible luck to be connected with people that really epitomized models and ways of being spiritually alive. And I felt very close to Darwin. I spent years being in his living room every Saturday night from 72 until he moved down here. It's a lot of years. And then 1975, I moved to Albany. I wound up going to graduate school there, simply so that I could be closer to his meetings in Schenectady. Almost every Saturday night was there, plus Friday and Sunday mornings, as part of that core group, people. And so the lessons, or what do I say, the ways that Darwin, was rooted, and alive in Meher Baba's presence. What do I say? That style is very natural for me, and always seemed to consolidate the sense of the aloneness, the inner contact theme. That Darwin, I think, spoke so eloquently about the inner working, within ourselves. How he spoke about that so well. Independence. I called him Mr. Inner Contact. That spoke to me because I was always known or felt the importance. As Henry Kashaudy would say, God doesn't see committees. We all have to really work it out for ourselves. Even when I moved to Boston, to Cambridge in 1978, I would drive, as you know, at least twice a month to Darwin's and back for years. So that mattered. I was training, kind of training in a way. But, as I said before, what have I done with that? I'm not so happy with. The gifts have been given. I don't know that I've taken them in so well. There's regret about making the most of what's been given. That's always there. In the back of my mind, the things that I've known that really matter are the things that Baba would talk about. I mean, on my tiny little way as a very gross conscious human being, in the back of my mind, there's always Baba and what are the higher values and what matters in a life. So if I'm working with a person or if I'm teaching a class, what matters to me ultimately, to the extent that I could get away with it without the administration killing me, is to help people find some truth that they can hang on to and to develop a perspective that's meaningful in their own life. Because I know that because I know from my own experience, a student in a college class who's going to think back about a course or a professor, what are they going to remember? It's not this teaching or that theory or that book. It's going to be some tiny little nugget of a flavor of something that they've been able to incorporate in their own life. That matters. Oh, here's what I remember about that 10 years ago. It's a tiny nugget which may be a very important piece of their own picture, right? And that has to come from some kind of level of experience that a person folds into their own life. So, to answer your question, being alive, trying to find him more and more, trying to find the reality of him in life is not all that different than the process of trying to be true to one's art, or try to work therapeutically with a person, or trying to teach some idea to somebody that they could do something with. I don't know. It's not all that different for me. I'll tell you a little experience, which may be fun. It was a dream. This is a 20-second story. One of the dreams, I could tell you another one too, but this shorter one, I was coming out of a car, and of course I've never been to Guru Prasad, but I've seen the photos. So, and I was with another family who came out of the same car, and they were Indian, and they came out and they started going up these steps of Guru Prasad. And I said to myself, oh, I'm not with them. I should hold back, let them go by themselves. And they go up the stairs, they disappear. And then I go up the stairs. And there was a door, like one of those revolving doors that you push, right? And that's what it was. So I go through this door, and as I'm going through the door, I know that Baba is to my left. I'm going there to see Mayor Baba. He's to the left. I go through there, I take a step into the hall, and the instant I walk in, I'm suddenly lifted up, blown up like a leaf, a big wind. High, 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 20 feet. And as I'm going up, I'm not at all scared. As I'm going up, and I hear this voice go like this, like a child's voice. Oops. I'm sorry. I forgot to turn down my divine radiance. And like Forrest Gump, the leaf, in ultra slow motion, I start to come down. I float down, and I'm down. Completely happy, and that's the dream. This was a dream, but it was very important. I was in a room, crowded, filled with people, and Baba was standing there. And there might have been 100, 200 people, and I come into the back of the room, and it's filled with people, and he's there. And I'm like this, trying to look, like this. And what's inside of me is, look at me. I need for him to look at me. I just need him to look at me, because he's doing this, like what he does, asking. And he doesn't see me at all, of course. And I'm like this. And inside of myself are two different voices. One is, have him look at you. He has to look at me, And the other one is, you're horrible. He'll do what he wants. Don't be greedy and selfish. Just. And it's like this, and I'm ravaged by guilt, this. I don't like people who make a show of themselves in that way, and I hated myself in that one, but it was like, but he said, be greedy for him, So this is going on, and then somehow the crowd parts, and he looks at me. And when he looks at me, his eyes directly, and the feeling was, everything stopped. It was totally frozen. And it's just this. And then all this is going on. And this happens 3 times. And my guilt and my self-hate increases. He did it. He looked at me. I said, do it again. Oh, you greedy little monster. It happens 3 times. And he looks at me 3 times. And in a way, it's not personal. Nothing is communicated except my breath was taken away and everything stopped. Okay, 3 times. Then the crowd somehow settles, and then it's just him and me. And he goes like this. Now, I know what this means. Come, right? In India, it's not like, come. And I say, like a far too cute idiot, oh, Baba, do you mean you want me to come to you? And he goes like this. Do you get that? It was like slightly disgusting, but And then I'm like an arrow. I don't know how, You've heard stories. It's like suddenly, and then I'm with him. And then suddenly he's seated and I'm standing above him. And he says to me, I don't remember that he gestured, but I heard, he says, have I ever brought you to my breast in embrace? And I say, I don't think so, Baba. The answer was no, but for some reason I was equivocal. I don't think so, Baba. And then he reaches up, takes my face, and he says, as he's bringing me, now you will really drown. And what it was like was being brought into the sun. And there was a very odd sense. Have you seen some of these movies where they show like an asteroid going into the sun? The screen is filled with the sun and you see a little asteroid, a tiny little point moving into it. Can you imagine that like that? So what I felt, saw, experienced was he wasn't giving me anything. He was simply bringing me closer to what he is. He is that. When you come closer, that's what it is. And in that sense, it was slightly disappointing. I'm only saying that now. It was very impersonal. Yes, he gave that to me. He brought me there. But it happens to anybody. You get closer, that's what happens. You see what I mean? So it's very weird that I had that thought. And then he brings me in. Everything disappears. It's the sun, absolutely the sun. And then as he brings me slowly out, it starts to fade. I'm further away. And then he tells me some other things, which I won't talk about.
This was a night dream?
Wow.
But, yeah. I think that's it, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.